Welcome back. It's time for our discussion right now, addressing Nigeria's revenue challenge as well as perhaps expenditure. Joining me right now are my guests. I will start from my immediate right, and the guest that is here with me in the studio, Professor Ken Ife, is the lead consultant at ECOWAS Commission. He's also a development economist. Welcome to you, Prof.
Thank you for having me.
And joining us online virtually is Kalu Aja, who is a financial analyst. He's joining us from the United States. Hello, Mr. Aja. Good to have you on the program. It's been quite a while coming, and thank you for joining us. I know it's quite early there, it's about 2:30 a.m. Thank you. We appreciate that. Can you hear me?
Hi, Nancy. How you doing?
I'm well.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Fadekemi Abiru is the editor-in-chief at Stairs Business. Hello, Fadekemi. Happy New Year. We haven't spoken this year, so welcome to the program.
Hi.
Okay, let's get started, and let's start with Prof here in the studio. Zainab Hamad, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, says that Nigeria has a revenue problem, not a debt sustainability program, not a debt sustainability challenge. In fact, she mentioned it, I think, last week at the Deloitte National Economic Outlook. I moderated a session there last week, and during her address, she said, we have a revenue challenge. We don't have a debt sustainability challenge. And I was like, Minister, what did you just say? You know, but Prof, just speak to me just like in a few seconds so that we can take what everybody thinks.
No, she's right, actually, because the debt to GDP is the measure that is being used across the world. And so we have substantial headroom. The benchmark is for countries, depending on the country, the benchmark is about 40%. Your debt to GDP. But for some countries that have a lot of infrastructure, that have very high stock of infrastructure, because that's what defines, their debt, like Japan, 233%, you know, America, over almost 90%, UK, they can violate those benchmarks because they have infrastructure and they're attracting investments. Our stock of infrastructure is only 35% of our GDP. I mean, South Africa is 80%. Many countries are over 100%. So that's number one. So we will hit that headroom soon, maybe by 2025. But the issue is, from her perspective, and that is right, is that the debt service is a very high proportion of government revenue. Normally, the benchmark should be around 40% of your debt service to your revenue. And then if you look further, you find that Nigeria's revenue, government revenue, tax revenue to GDP is about 7%. Now, the average is about 18%. ECOWAS convergence, macroeconomic convergence criteria says 20% minimum. And so there's a strategic revenue mobilization initiative that wants to push from 7% to 15% in the short term to 2025. So that is what she says, is we need to ramp up revenue. And there's so many leakages in the system.
I'll come back to the question of revenue leakages. But Mr. Kalu, let me come over to you there. You've listened to Prof. Do you agree with the minister that we have a revenue challenge? Because Prof has just argued debt to GDP, we're still not there. The ceiling, I think, about 40%. We are not there yet. But is that really the argument? I think what we should be arguing should be debt to revenue.
Yeah, correct, Nancy. GDP does not pay debt. Your revenue pays debt. So that's a simple answer. And the simple answer, again, to if we have a spending problem or a revenue problem, it's clear we have a spending problem. I mean, just today I saw the news in Nigeria. We're spending about 328 million naira on consultancy for the railways. Not to build the railways. This is to consult how we're going to build the railways. Think about that, $328 million. We're borrowing. China has said they're not going to fund railways anymore, so we're going to Standard Chartered, and still we're paying $328 million to people to regularize or to inspect the railway. So the problem is revenues, it's spending. 1970 to 1973, Nigeria got the oil boom. So we got a lot of monies from crude oil sales. In those years, Nigeria did not spend up to 1% on education. So the argument about revenues goes out the window. When we got money, we don't spend it properly. Gulf War inflow, we wasted it. We've spent and wasted lots of opportunities when oil prices have gone up. Like now, oil price at $93, and we're spending on consultancies for railways. So the simple answer is this: Nigeria has a spending problem. We are spending based on income, not based on our plans or based on basically what we can afford. We are trying to cut that coat according to our size rather than our income. And that's what I think the problem is. We are wasteful spenders. That's in simple terms.
We are wasteful spenders. We'll come back to that shortly. Fadekebi, what's your own view? The National Assembly right now says, at least last week, they did say from the Senate President that it will begin to give revenue-generating agencies targets to also check revenue leakages and to ensure that we get more revenue so that we don't borrow as much as we're borrowing right now. Is that a step in the right direction?
Thanks, Nancy. So I just have to say that the sound is a bit broken up for me, so I couldn't really hear you properly.
Oh.
But I guess like my own contribution to the discussion would just be more around, even going back when we're talking about like, Nigeria's like spending and revenue problem, which one is it? And even just thinking about the question of our debt sustainability. One of the things, while I agree that yes, like our debt to GDP ratio, I think it sits around like 22%, and that's still far below the IMF's recommendation of 35%. But one of the things that I like to do is actually query that debt to GDP ratio because, it doesn't account for the actual composition of debts that we have been taking on. So for example, like if you look at the fact that Nigeria has actually been taking on like far too much external debt. Just in like my research that has gone into this, like from I think 2016, we had 20% that was the composition of our external debt, and that has already risen to 38% now. And like there are problematic reasons that arise like when you have too much external debt. Can you still hear me? It says
yes,
my internet
yes, we can hear
unstable.
you.
Okay, all right. But what I was just saying was just, on our external debt being problematic, and the fact that, Nigeria has to actually like source foreign exchange to continue to repay our debt. And that leaves us in this, perpetual state of dollar scarcity, where we're constantly borrowing. We're constantly borrowing just to borrow more. So, for me, it's just about going back to that question of like, how are we defining debt sustainability, and if that even measures up to like basically telling us that we're okay when it comes to the amount of debt that we've taken on.
Okay. Prof, you talked about revenue leakages. You can see that Mr. Ajak clearly did not agree with you in terms of we have a spending problem, and you alluded to it a bit in terms of revenue leakages. I did ask earlier, the National Assembly, the Senate President last week says that they will be giving revenue generating agencies targets and follow them to see that we'll generate more revenue so that we can check the borrowings. What do you think? And where are these leakages really coming from? Kalu has said we have a spending problem, but the other issue is that the little we are also generating, where is it going to? Are they going to private pockets? How do we also check that?
Well, there are significant revenue leakages. For example, if you look at the concessions given, waivers, tax waivers to some of the imports, so quite a lot of it, and when you start adding them up, because I was in a Senate hearing on the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007, and the chair was announcing big figures that make me shook, actually. So we felt that we need to come on top of that. And you see that in the Finance Act, they were going down on that. You also hear ministers saying that they are going to comprehensively review all those. Then you have other things like transfer pricing, which could be as high as $8 billion a year. On Africa scale is $84 billion a year. So that's a lot of money. And part of the reason is because we have double taxation. So many companies will not have their group head office in Nigeria. So they will go and rather have it in Dubai or other low tax constituencies because of double taxation. Finance Act 2019 removed it. Now they are now is open, now they can come and have their head office who is subjected to that. So these are some of the revenue leakages. But if you're talking about how what else we spend money on, we have deficit, infrastructure deficit, and it's horrendous. To be 35% of your GDP is so small. We are among the lowest in Africa. And you know we haven't built the rail. The rail is the cheapest form of long distance transportation of heavy, big goods. And we haven't got that. We only have one or two that are functional. And you can see the oversubscription on those. Then we're not using inland waterways for movement of anything. And then we are now down to transport, road transport. And the level of decay on those road transport is so much that to transport goods from as far as Katsina to Lagos or Port Harcourt, which could cost you 75,000 to 100,000 naira per ton, if you did it only in one day, now goes to about 3 days before you get from there to there. So because of insecurity, they go, they stop. They go, they stop. So think about a journey of 1 day now, 3 days, minimum of 2, and then the whole prices increase. So, and then of course the diesel that they use is deregulated, so it's very high. So all of that compound the thing. So the government has to spend. And then of course, you know the government spends about 500 billion every year on social investment fund. And there are many things that need money. Agriculture needs 10%, according to AU. We're not getting as much as the education. They say 15%, health 15% of GDP. We're not getting anywhere. Government, we're not getting anywhere near those.
Okay, Mr. Jack, over to you.
And of course, insecurity. Insecurity, you can't compromise that.
Okay. Mr. Jack, over to you, and let's take a look at it from this. Earlier on in my market analysis, I did say Brent crude today, at least this morning, as at 9:45 a.m. Nigerian time, selling for $92. Yet, what we're getting from oil is not meeting our needs. I think I saw what we sold last year at about 3.9 or 4 trillion naira oil proceeds. Deficit this year is over 6 trillion naira. The question right now would be, oil is not meeting our revenue needs. Taxes clearly not meeting, though FIRS told us that last year they did make 6 trillion naira. They can't tax us more than they're taxing us now. We're talking about widening the tax base. So the logical question right now is that where do we get additional revenue?
Well, why don't you just stop paying subsidy? That's 2 trillion. And we stopped paying subsidy in the budget and we put it back in because we know because there's an election coming up, we don't want to lose the election. So we put 2 trillion naira back into the budget. And now we have to fund that extra 2 trillion. Why not stop what we can easily stop? Fuel subsidies. Why not cut down the cost of government? National Assembly is building a 5 billion naira library. 5 billion. It's not a public library, it's National Assembly library. So why don't you just cut down the spending first of all? I mean, if a man doesn't earn enough money, should he buy a Rolls Royce? It's a very basic financial planning that we have to do in Nigeria. To look at Nigeria as a person and say, you can't afford all these revenues. You can't afford a presidential air fleet. It's a tiny savings, but it sends a message. If the president says we're going to sell all the SUVs and the private jets, it sends a message that we're going to start to cut down on waste and graft. Our Arsenal report has been sitting out there. So the first thing is cut down the spending. That's the first revenue earner right there. Then, of course, have to do a lot of taxes. Nigeria has the lowest tax revenue base all across Africa, in the entire African continent, I think in the entire world. This is quoting the vice president of Nigeria. Lowest tax to GDP. So what can we tax? We have to devolve power so that we can tax. Why should we own railways? If Nigeria, the federal government owns the railways, then it has to borrow and fund them. But if it devolved power, say, past the Railways Act, and the railways were owned by the private sector, then it might not have to spend so much to borrow, to build railways, to go to Kano, to Maradi and all that, when we haven't built Lagos to Calabar. So these are choices we have to make. Spending is a choice. But to get to your specific answer to the question, what else can we tax? You know, what's the growing part of the economy? Trade is growing, agriculture is growing, even financial services are growing. Cryptocurrencies, trading, financial services, fintech, that's the big growing area in Nigeria right now. and the federal government makes its money from corporate income taxes. Why don't we tax that growing sector of fintechs and cryptocurrencies and develop an industry in Nigeria? We have the people with the language, and we have the expertise in this. India is taxing crypto 30%. In our case, we're blocking it. So we have to be a bit more innovative in spending and earning. We just can't block, tax rise, tax borders. Those are so, we have to think forward. We are growing at 3% every year by population. So every year as we speak, the expenditure is going to keep on growing. And if we don't get innovative in how we can tax and save money, then we're going to have a problem down the line.
Carlo, let me still stick with you. Since you said, let's take away the subsidy we're paying on fuel, how do you think that the government should navigate it? Because this is a problem that has transcended 3 presidents, from Obasanjo to Yar'Adua to Jonathan, now Buhari, so 4 presidents, as it were. And it seemingly is a huge task, because anytime the government wants to take it off, there's public outcry. I remember the World Bank National Development Update that was released in December of last year. In that report, the World Bank says that 13,000 naira is what each person has, like a Nigerian, 13,000 naira subsidy, unlike 3,000 naira on health. So it's clear. The governors, governor of Kaduna State that represented the governors at that forum, they say that if you don't stop this subsidy, we will not be able to pay salaries. And I was like, okay, governor, you should get your IGR right, you know. But the question is it between the chicken and the egg? How should government navigate this? Because it makes economic sense to take it off. But the social angle is not is hard.
Yeah, but Nancy, we have technology. We have the BVN. Nigerians have a phone. Pay the subsidy at the pumps, not at the port. So you take your car, when you register your car, they tag your car to your BVN, right? Make it voluntary. You register your car to your BVN. You get to the fuel station, you buy fuel. Then you pay with your phone, say with eNaira on an app, and your car has got a quota. So when you buy fuel, you pay with eNaira at the subsidized price. This will reduce the amount of subsidy because you're only paying to Nigerian registered cards that are paying taxes. You're not going to pay subsidy for smuggled fuel. If you pay the subsidy at the port, and you say if you have an SUV, you pay more. You pay more, you don't get the subsidy. But if you have, say, a motorcycle or a small cylinder car, you pay less fuel price, so you end the subsidy. That way you make the subsidy progressive, right? And you can implement it, and you can save it, and you can track it. When you pay subsidy at the port, the tankers go across to Nigeria, to Cameroon, to Benin and all that. But if you pay it at the Nigerian pump at the filling station, we all have phones, we all have BVN. We were selling fertilizers through phones. So why can't we sell gas to cars at the pumps in Nigeria? It can be done. This is technology. We can get it done in a week and it will work. But we don't want to do it, because if we do it, price of fuel goes up, then you lose elections. So we keep on going around this. It's not hard to do. We can do it in a week.
Okay, Fadekemi, with what we're seeing right now, the minister saying that we have a revenue challenge, we don't have a debt sustainability challenge. Will it be right to say that Nigeria is really broke? Because what we are making, your income, your income is not sustaining you, So is Nigeria broke? And our government is refusing, I don't know. What's your view?
I mean, not to be a fearmonger, but I think I'll go as far as to say the Nigerian government is broke. And the way I'll just back that up is just thinking about the fact that, you know, when we track like our spending and revenue trajectory over the years, like, you know, Nigeria has constantly like exceeded our spending targets, but we're constantly underperforming when it comes to hitting our revenue targets. And then also, I think another point that I'll just use to back that up would be even looking at the recently published National Development Plan. So in there, I think the government has, basically planned to spend about 350 trillion naira, just in terms of, for advancing the economy and achieving like its developmental goals. And in the document itself, like when you go through it, you can see that the NDP, so that's the National Development Plan, actually expects the private sector to provide 300 trillion naira in financing over the next 5 years. So it's just speaking to the fact that the government itself cannot actually fund its own development goals. It's actually relying on the private sector to foot this bill. It's quite unclear how this is going to happen, just because, when we think 21 alone, so just last year, total domestic private investment was less than 45 trillion naira. So that's just 15% of the required amount that the government is expecting to get from the private sector. So it just essentially throws up a lot of questions around, how we're going to be able to fund the spending that the government plans to embark on, just so we can, fulfill like our development goals over the next 5 years. It is possible for the private sector to step in. There are different ways for this to happen. I think something that a lot of people would be quite familiar with would be PPP, so public-private partnerships. So that's one of the things that the NDP has also, kind of touched on in terms of expecting that kind of investment to help with funding developmental projects. But, these have already been in place before. There are no plans as to, how this is actually going to, what structures or what reforms are going to come into place to ensure that these PPPs actually work even better. So essentially, when I just take a step back, I say just thinking about the fact that, over time, our spending has constantly surpassed our revenues over the past couple of years, it is likely that, we can actually summarize that the government is broke and they really need to fix their approach to spending.
Prof, if we take a look at the two sources where revenue comes from the federal government, oil and non-oil, I know that I think in 2016 was when we saw the non-oil revenue overtake the oil revenue. If you take a look at that sector right now, with COVID-19 pandemic and all of that, do you still see that potential that the non-oil source would give us more revenue than oil? Oil is trading close to over $90 right now. I think the last time we saw oil at over $100 was whether 2011 or so. So what do you think?
Yeah, actually, the resilience of the economy is improving based on the fact that we now have an inflection where the oil revenue, non-oil revenue is about 92.7%. And then the oil revenue has dropped significantly from just under 10% to 7.49%, something like that. And that trend is continuing. And if you look at the recoveries that we've been having, they are driven by non-oil revenue. The second point is that the government revenue, oil revenue as a proportion of government revenue has dropped to 35%. So the non-oil revenue as a proportion of government revenue is about 65%. Now what that means in effect on two counts, if we now have a shock an exothermic shock in the oil sector that reduces our oil revenue by about 40% or even 50%. Now the effective impact on the economy is going to be minimal. So we are now able to absorb that shock. It's very, very unlikely that that shock would drag us into recession. So it's good news. And I think it's going to continue. The projections show that the projections of to 2025 is sliding down. So that's a good news.
Okay, Carlo, most governments around the world, if not all, rely on taxes, as a source of revenue for them. Here in the country, our tax to GDP ratio is about 6%. I said earlier, FIRS said that it's collected about 6 trillion last year. That's the highest so far in history. But the question is, if the government is really going on an aggressive tax drive like it's going on now with sugar tax and all of that, will these taxes really be the solution? Will it really unplug that revenue gap?
Yes, it will. Irrespective of the spending that I've highlighted, Nigeria's debt tax to GDP is very, very low. It's the lowest in the world. I heard Dr. Brown in the session say that Afghanistan collects more taxes than Nigeria, i.e., with the Taliban and all that, they collect more taxes than Nigeria. So clearly, we can raise our tax contribution and revenues. That is clear. So there should be no argument about that. We should also raise the tax revenues. We should, and where does the government get monies from? Is corporate income taxes. So it's a lot of small corporations in Nigeria that do not pay tax. Let's not get into why, but they don't pay a tax. Either tax is too high or it's over collected, multiple taxes, levies. I mean, if you go to Lekki Phase 1, it's literally a little cluster of companies, no signs outside, because you're paying for signboards, you're paying for water, you're paying for business taxes, television, transportation, the area for the Comcast and all that. So lots of multiple taxes. Maybe that's why people don't want to pay. You can maybe simplify it and then broaden the base. Then maybe you can get more tax revenues in. Okadas, all that stuff. Make it reduce the taxes, and then people should pay instead of them paying all this money to the touts. Maybe they can pay to the state and federal. But the taxes can go up. That's what we need to do. Get the tax contributions up. Get the people behind the taxes. But I have to make this point. People don't pay taxes again because they don't trust the government to spend that tax money properly. That really is the elephant in the room. If you trust people to spend your money, then people will pay. In the Southeast in the 1960s or 80s or so, I know my dad was collecting money with his friend and they were building an airport in Imo State. And I used to wonder, why are you guys building an airport? Isn't that what the government should do? But they built an airport in Imo State, and I know all the Igbo quote unquote men then taxed themselves and built an airport. So that was a tax, and people contributed and built it. Because leadership back then, I think they believed that those people could trust them with tax revenues. If you believe that tax revenues are not going to be spent appropriately, that will be taken by the National Assembly and spent to build a $5 billion library, you won't pay a tax.
I know we can stay here all day and discuss this issue, because if we also take a look at it, there are some other countries, even across Africa, that have the same problem of revenue. Over there in Ghana now, I know they are fighting for even more taxes. There's what they call e-levy. We've seen so much basbos in Ghana's parliament that they don't want to pay and all of that. They're even raising fuel prices and all of that. But Fadikemi, let me come to you right now and ask the question around borrowing. We know that we borrowed, I think, about $30 billion, just I think in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, that the National Assembly gave the executive that approval. How should we conduct our borrowing moving forward? How should we have responsible borrowing? Fadikemi, that's for you.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. So I think the first question that you asked me, one of the things that I commented on was the composition of our debt. So the fact that, a growing proportion of the debt that we keep acquiring is actually external. And, the downsides to acquiring so much external debt in that way means that you are exposed to foreign exchange you're exposed to foreign exchange currency risk. So, for example, if the naira was supposed to lose its value, or let me take that again. One of the most common ways for Nigeria to practice external borrowing is through Euro bonds. So that's one of the ways that we just basically borrow externally. And so while Euro bonds themselves tend to have low interest rates, which is something that, I'm assuming that the Nigerian government is basically taking advantage of and making sure that, they're not having to repay too much on the debts that they acquire. So that's one good thing about Euro bonds. But the downsides to it is you're actually collecting these debt obligations in foreign currency. And so if the naira were to lose its value, which it currently is, then that basically makes your debt even more expensive, right? And so that's something that the government would have to like feel the crunch of, like, as we go forward, and that's why we continue to see debt servicing ratio being such a huge proportion, a big proportion of, or it accounts for a huge proportion of like what it is that we're actually spending for. I think it's about like 87% was around that figure. Another thing is just also thinking about the fact that ways and means financing. So that's essentially just the CBN printing money for the Nigerian government. That has been a huge source of like the Nigerian government's borrowing. And again, that's also a very, very expensive, that's a very, very expensive form of borrowing. And it's something that, has just been increasing significantly over the years. So essentially borrowing, the way the Nigerian government has been practicing borrowing, focusing so much on those two sources is just something that we need to revisit quite urgently. Otherwise, we'll just be stuck in this like perpetual debt cycle where the opportunity cost of borrowing will just continue to increase because we can't spend it elsewhere. Even just thinking about the fact that, we're not able to put enough money into things like capital expenditure. I think that's been mentioned already on today's call, the low amount of funding that's been allocated to, social services like healthcare, even education as well, the kinds of things that actually contribute to, furthering economic development. A well-educated workforce or a healthy workforce is like a productive workforce. And so if the Nigerian government is not seen to be investing in that, just because we're very, very concerned with repaying the people who lend to us, then that's not a good look.
Okay, apart from what we've said, Prof, in terms of, okay, let's get even more people to tax. There's a school of thought also that says we have a lot of debt capital around. You have, I think Okonjo-Iweala at the time moved what we call property taxes and all of that. Do you see on the part of this administration a clear blueprint of raising revenue? Since this has been the issue, since this, at least in the last 2 to 3 years, the minister have been saying this. Is there a clear blueprint to address that apart from what we're seeing now? Okay, introducing sugar tax, we are going to unlock 141 billion, we're doing this and all of that. Is there any other thing that gives you hope?
Oh yeah. They have a strategic revenue generating initiative, and that's loaded, and you could see a lot of it coming out from the Finance Act 2021. And I've never advised government to increase the tax. I haven't. I said widen the tax base, and that's what the government is doing, widening the tax base. Because even though the tax revenue to GDP is so low, and on paper it looks as if we are the lowest tax in the continent, but the implicit tax makes Nigeria the highest tax burden in Africa for businesses. There's a survey that says 66% of manufacturing companies say that they provide power 90% of the time. So what are you talking about? These people are doing borehole for their business. They put in generators. They're doing their own access road. And so when you look at that implicit tax, you're already taxing them to the roof. So we need to widen the base, and that's what they're doing, to make sure they bring more people into the tax net. If you look at e-Naira, it should bring more people into the net, because 40% of the population are not even in the banking sector. But when you transfer, some tax goes. So that's the additional revenue. And then you've seen 5G is bringing revenue. And then you see a lot more traction on I've been to one Senate hearing where they were pouring venom on MDAs, agencies of government. And what the law says is this. Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007 is what governs borrowing. Borrowing is on the exclusive legislative list. For you to borrow, it says you can only borrow for capital project. You can't borrow for revenue expenditure. You can't borrow to pay salaries. And then capital project or human resource development, which means education, health, maybe employment, stuff like that. But not for other reasons. And then it has to be a long-term borrowing, and it has to be at concessionary rates, which we know is 3%. So when you go to foreign borrowing, you get concessionary rates. When you do domestic, you see that they are all around 11%, 12%, 10%, so it's a bit higher domestically. But even then, in the current situation where we are looking at a 3 trillion subsidy bill, I would advise government to do a lot more domestic borrowing. Because what happens is that if they are doing domestic borrowing, they are sucking out excess liquidity from the system, so that central bank doesn't get forced into bumping up MPR, monetary policy rate, as a way of reducing liquidity. Because if you do that, you sacrifice employment, you sacrifice growth.
But I'm just thinking, if government does that, wouldn't it crowd out the private sector?
No. The thing is that we have excess liquidity. Even in the private sector, we have extra 5 trillion from the banks going into the private sector. You have a lot of money on COVID. 3.5 trillion from the monetary authority, 2.3 trillion from the fiscal. Yes. And there is so much money, and election year. So the money is so there's a lot of sources of money coming in. So you have to take out gradually so that inflation can be tamed a little bit. So rather than, they should use that to mop, rather than allow CBN to raise the rates, which will hurt growth and all of that. And so in the context of the agencies paying money, there are legal, there are regulatory and administrative measures being put in place. Administratively, they are saying to them, look, you know what, I don't want you to spend more than, your capital expenditure should not be more than 50% of the revenue. Okay. So they're going through that, okay? But if you come into the law, because that's not inside the law. If you come into the law, the fiscal responsibility 2007, it says you have to give 80% of your operating surplus should be remitted to the Consolidated Revenue Fund. And then if not, we will come down on you like a ton of bricks and take 25% of your money at source. So which they are now beginning to do for some of the ones who are not bringing in their account.
Okay, let me bring in this aspect, and as we close, Kalu, Prof has mentioned, you know, for me, when I take a look at these things, I also question them. If you're borrowing for capex, is all capex borrowing right? And is all is all spending on recurrent expenditure wrong? I hope you get my question. Because in the Nigerian context now, you understand, is all capex expenditure right? Okay, we need to borrow for capital expenditure. But is it right? Just as we close in about 45 seconds.
Yeah, I think Prof's an economist, so he knows better. This is his trend. But the marginal property to consume and spend and all that, sometimes if you build an airport in, say, Yobe, it might not have as much multiplier value than just giving the people in Yobe cash to spend. If you build an airport in, say, Lagos, you get more bang for your money. So not all capex is good and not all recurrence is bad. That's the quick answer to it. So you have to basically, poverty is a big problem. Lack of consumption is a big problem. So if you actually give people cash and they spend, sometimes that might be a better way to spend money than actually building this big airport that one plane lands in a quarter.
Fadekemi, just quickly as we close, Fadekemi. Just quickly, your closing thoughts.
I think I largely agree with what has been said. Honestly, government spending in Nigeria just has to be efficient and generate results. Everything that I've said about, you know, the Nigerian government going on a spending spree, that's not necessarily to say that I'm against government spending. You know, there are very, very good reasons for the government to, you know, embark on like a lot of spending, whether it's, you know, to kickstart an economy that has suffered 2 recessions in the past decade, or even upgrade our inadequate infrastructure. The last time I looked, our country's infrastructure stock was measured at 35% of GDP, and that's compared to like 58% in India or even 87% in South Africa. So honestly, like we just need to think about the fact that, you know, when we advocate for government spending, it's because we expect it to generate a multiplier effect, you know, where 1 naira of government spending generates more than 1 naira worth of value for the economy. So whatever that looks like, whether it's, you know, investing into infrastructure, it's, you know, direct like cash transfers to poor people so that they can, you know, increase their own consumption, and that also adds a boost to the economy. All of these different things matter, and it's all down to the government to actually make the right choices so that we can improve the efficiency of our government spending. World Economic Forum actually, you know, places Nigeria on, I think it's 120th, like that's our position when it comes to the efficiency of government spending. That's below Pakistan, that's below Bulgaria, that's below like Honduras, and like all of these countries are not necessarily like already like in a good place, like politically and economically. So Nigeria really needs to raise her ranking when it comes to these kinds of indicators.
Thank you, Fadeke, and I want to say thank you to this wonderful panel. Thank you very much. I wish we had more time, but I want to say we're grateful for your contributions this morning. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Prof. Professor Ken Ife is the lead consultant at ECOWAS Commission. Thank you, Kalu Aja, for waking up this early in the U.S. and joining us. We appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining us. Kalu Aja is a financial analyst. Fadeke Abiru is the editor-in-chief of STARS. Thank you, Fadeke. Let's talk again soon. That's the much we can take on today's edition of the program. Thank you all for keeping a date with us. Please keep a date with me again tomorrow, same time, 11 a.m. on this channel, African Independent Television. I am Nancy Naji. Be the best you can be and be that change that you want to see. I'll see you all again tomorrow. Bye.